Hi, this is Derrick Ramsey, Secretary of the Labor Cabinet for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I'm coming to you live from Kentucky State University College of Ag. Today I have the privilege of being joined by my dear friend, John Tilley, Secretary of Justice. And as we were talking before earlier, John, welcome.
That's right. Thank you, Derrick. I appreciate that. Happy to be here.
Okay. I want to talk to you about some of the incredible things that we were able to accomplish in the year 2017 under the leadership of our governor, Governor Bevin, the guy with endless vision. And I will go out and talk to him about different things that was going on around the workplace throughout the state of Kentucky. And some of the things were remarkable that we found. But interesting enough, as I would talk to him about them, and I'm certain as you would talk to him about them, things came up. For example, can you talk to us about the expungement bill?
Well, I mean, it's a critical piece. I mean, I think you believe, as I believe, and the governor believes, that folks deserve that second chance, a shot at redemption, restoration, and one of those things is getting a clean slate. You know, Derrick, we have 100 million Americans now in this country with criminal records which inhibit employment in really difficult ways for them. And the inability to get meaningful employment often turns people back toward crime and a life of hopelessness, and if not crime, just a life without meaning, and the inability to support a family. And so allowing the expungement, and these are just the lowest level felonies. I think some would like to continue to expand to give people a second chance. Certainly there are certain felonies that would never be considered eligible for expungement, but this particular piece of legislation allows the majority of the lowest level Class D felonies to be expunged, and that gives people that clean start. And let me add this to it. Understand that when people go, 4 to 5 years without another offense after being released from prison, they're just as likely as you or I, who don't have criminal records, to commit a crime. So, in other words, they are a safe bet for employers and communities. And again, this is a matter of dignity, as our governor said so often. And without, let's say this too, you work on this daily, 180, 90,000 open jobs in this state. Without folks coming out of the criminal justice system being able to get into our workforce, we'll never fill these gaps we have right now.
That's right. You know, an interesting part about that also is you mentioned 180, 190,000 folk, but also what's critical is that 95, and I've heard you say this on a number of occasions, between 95 to 97% of those folks that are incarcerated are coming back home.
That's right.
And so having said that, we have to be receptive and giving these folks a second chance.
Well, that's part of the vision you talked about from the governor, and we've been working on these things for so long. And let me say this, without the governor's leadership on this issue, it would have been languishing in the General Assembly like it had for so many years. When I was there, we tried to pass the bill. We came close, but folks finally came together with a governor who stood up and supported this. But again, over 95% of all those incarcerated today will come home. And that's a national number. It varies. But without jobs, without transportation, without housing, without treatment in some cases for an addiction or a mental health issue, these individuals who deserve that second chance are not going to get it. And so it is critical that we look at the big picture, and that brings us to the reentry question, which I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions on.
We'll get to that. And also another piece is that the family support.
Oh, absolutely.
That too is critical, and sometimes families are absent. You know, another part, as I traveled around the state and I'm talking to employers, one of the things that they would constantly hit me with, they say, Secretary, it's great, your initiative, we understand what the governor's trying to do, but what are you all doing about it? And so what I would do is I would come back and talk to the governor and say, Governor, what I'm hearing from the employers is that, we're asking them to give people a second chance, but what's state government doing? Hence, ban the box. Talk about that, will you?
Well, I mean, again, it's the governor not forcing the private sector or employers to do anything, but again, that's sort of putting our money where our mouth is in that respect. To say, listen, for state employees, we are going to, again, initiate what we call fair chance hiring.
That's right.
Others have called it ban the box. But it's essentially, ultimately we'll know whether or not somebody has a criminal record, but give them that shot to get an interview. Don't have to check that box initially. Let them get that foot in the door and prove their worth, because oftentimes folks like us who make hiring decisions would like to talk to someone, find out if they are in fact worthy of the job, and then look at what troubles they've had in the past.
That's right.
We just hired somebody who had a fairly significant event happen over 20 years ago, but this particular individual, she was dynamic, she was right for the job, and they asked me, does this charge bother you? 20 years ago, she addressed it. It does not, because she has led such a productive and meaningful life since then without that mistake.
That's right.
And again, that was a mistake at a young age. We need to allow people to move on with their lives, and it helps communities.
Absolutely.
It cuts crime. It helps us support families. You know, Derrick, you and I have talked about this. Kentucky, sadly, it's our beloved state, the Commonwealth.
Right.
We are oftentimes first where we need to be last in rankings, and last where we need to be first. And one of the things that pains me the most about our criminal justice system in this state, Kentucky has the highest percentage of children who have had or have currently an incarcerated parent.
Wow.
You mentioned the strain on families.
That's right.
And I could talk about that. We have the second highest rate of per capita incarceration for women, for girls and young women, and it's in women generally. That's painful.
Right.
That's something that just rips away at the fabric of our families, and it really hits families and children harder here than elsewhere, and that's something we've got to fix.
Right. When you see that, and I don't know if there's any data out there that supports it, when you have a parent that's incarcerated, what kind of long-term effects does it have for the family as well as for those kids while those parents are incarcerated?
Well, we know that criminologists would tell you that a lot of crime and the acceptance of jail and prison becomes generational. It becomes something that while it's never welcomed. I mean, listen, for those who think that jail or prison is some respite from life and that people don't mind serving, that's nothing could be further from the truth.
Right.
I mean, are there instances where people want to get arrested who are people who are homeless or people who become institutionalized?
Right.
I think those are rare circumstances.
Right.
It's not a fun place to be. People want out. Trust me, I get thousands of letters all the time. You may get a few too, where people really want out of this. Very difficult circumstances. And so I think the way it rips at the fabric of families is in so many ways. You don't have the support. Maybe it's a father or mother. It's oftentimes fathers who are incarcerated. They can't support their children, their families. They don't have the contact. Visitation behind the wall is very difficult, even if it's done well.
Right.
And I think we do it well most places. There's not enough of it. There's not enough time to bond with those kids. You and I made that trip to Kansas.
Right.
And the ability, oftentimes, fathers can't even afford to make those expensive phone calls every other day or every day. And
or period, in some
period
cases.
at all. But some who are working in prison industries who make a bit of a living, which we may talk about as well.
We will.
They have the chance to really talk to their kids sometimes every day.
Right.
And that makes
contact a heck of a difference.
Makes a world of difference. And that's important. So I mean, there's so many ways we can help nurture the relationship and hopefully allow them to reintegrate themselves with their families when they get out.
Right.
And that makes a world of difference. So again, it's a win for public safety, and it's a win for the taxpayer generally.
I'll tell you one of the things I really, really enjoyed working on last year, and again under the leadership of Governor Bevin, was a CJ PAC.
Right.
And so from the CJ PAC, we came out with Senate Bill 120. Tell us about it.
Well, we've talked about all these things, and it really runs into what is in Senate Bill 120. It's really a re-entry focused bill. It's not that there aren't other provisions, but it's all about this idea, again, as you said first, 95% or more of all those currently serving time in jail or prison, in particular our prisons, are going to come home at some point. And it's our job from a public safety standpoint, and I think it's government's job to try to rebuild an infrastructure that's really maybe never has been there like it should be to help folks get back on their feet. Now some might say, why do we go to these lengths? Aren't we spending money? Why don't we just let them, like everybody else, find their own way? Well, the problem is with a felony on your record, you become really it's been called an economic death sentence, sort of a scarlet letter.
Right.
So that's the first barrier. The second is that you have people who oftentimes lack the education, they lack a job skill, they lack the ability to have what some call soft skills, but they don't have some of those necessary traits to get back in the workforce, and they're not given that chance.
Right.
So if we don't do that, then oftentimes there's another victim waiting. The community is at risk because you have a frustrated, hopeless individual who may have to turn back to whatever life of crime led them there in the first place. And so it's critical. It's such a common sense thing to do to help people get back on their feet.
Right.
And so this bill does that. This bill, I think, is put Kentucky again in the national spotlight. You know, even though we have high rates of per capita incarceration now, we've taken steps to safely lower our prison population, and while it's still growing, it's stabilized from where it had been growing at almost quadruple the national average. And today we're at 24,000 and some. Today, Derrick, we would be well over 30,000, most would say today. So there are some small victories there, but we can go further. And this bill helps do that by working on, again, ways to assimilate folks back into society, preloading education behind the wall that you and I have worked on personally together, getting the skills needed, and connecting people to jobs. The governor signed our reorg, which is a reorganization of a division under corrections called reentry. So now we have 30 people working on this particular mission, and sometimes that single mission focus is what drives numbers. If we could just cut the recidivism rate, which is above the national average in Kentucky, it's well over 40% any way you slice it, depending on a 2 or 3 year look. We could not only save millions in our prison system, which we're spending twice as much as we should as a state, in my estimation. But we could save millions, and we could help communities and fill those gaps in the workforce, get families and children reunited. There are just so many wins to be had. And again, I applaud you for your leadership. I don't know when a Secretary of Labor has engaged in this and shown the leadership you have to help us pass legislation like this.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. You know, it's interesting. As I think about what all occurred last year, and as you've heard me state on a number of occasions, one of the things that I am going to look at our cabinet to see how we've been successful, or how I'm going to look at us being successful, was how many collaborations we had with other secretaries, with other cabinets. And I am delighted that you and I had an opportunity to collaborate with Justice to Journeyman.
Absolutely.
Talk about it.
Well, I mean, it's what I love most about it is it didn't take us a couple of years to figure this out.
That's right.
I remember you being in my office in a chair like that when we're sitting across from one another, and it seemed like it was we hadn't been there but a minute, as they say, but maybe a couple of months, and we were already planning this program to really roll out through our Department of Corrections under Justice. But it stands for the proposition that we are, again, as I mentioned a bit earlier, we are going to, and we've always taught skills behind the wall, but oftentimes we didn't teach them. They weren't directly, again, you couldn't direct somebody to a job. They didn't translate that well to the world outside the prison, because there's a couple things. Oftentimes people couldn't even get certified to do the work we were training them for. That's another piece of Senate Bill 120 that we'll talk about, the occupational license piece and allowing people to get certified. But you and I designed something where we have 4 juvenile justice facilities teaching skills, you know, electrician, you know, IT work, carpentry, and many other things that are so needed, the trades. But this idea, again, and your work in apprenticeships is revolutionary in making your leadership has become national in this field of creating apprenticeships. But it's the idea that we can teach these really highly sought after skills with, again, 4 juvenile facilities and 3 prisons. We want to expand it at some point, but start with that fairly modest approach, but make sure that we teach these skills and then connect these individuals returning to a real job that really provides for their family. And there's such a piece of dignity there. And again, working with labor, you all had all the expertise we needed and we hadn't been doing that. So why weren't we why weren't we talking to the people? I mean, I know we've talked to Hal Heiner too, in education and workforce, and we can talk about talking to Secretary Glisson with all the things going on in Health and Family Services, but that's the kind of collaboration, knocking down those silos that existed for so many years and working together.
You know, it's interesting. You know, when we talk about jobs, here in the state of Kentucky, presently today, there's 200,000 open jobs.
Yeah.
Fast forward that to 2024, that number is going to be 700,000 jobs. And as I look at Kentucky and think back what occurred over 25 years ago, Kentucky was at this level, and I'd argue that over the last 25 years, we maybe have grown by 200,000 to 300,000 people. And so we're getting another opportunity at it. Because when you look at the Great Migration now, people are moving from the west, they're moving from the east and the northeast, and they're leveling off in Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio, and down. And so what my hopes are is that we get this second chance now, we do something with it. Now, to further that conversation, until this year, until last year, 2017, the record number for us for new business was $5.1 billion. This past year was $9.1 billion. So the word is out about Kentucky. And so we here in Kentucky have to start thinking, doing, and responding to things differently. Hence our trip, our experience out in Kansas. Talk to our viewers about that.
Well, you know, we like to borrow from states, and states borrow from us, things we do well. I mean, so it's no, should be no shock to anyone that we try to find states where things are working well. So looking at Kansas, I mean, Governor Bevin had a relationship with Governor Brownback, and Kansas had been singled out as a state that was good at prison industries, having private and progressive in that way, having private sector come into a prison and set up shop and allowing those inmates to work, but at a real job just behind the wall.
Right.
And talking to the inmates like we did, who are also employees, the kind, again, I keep going back to this word, but the kind of dignity it restored to them. We talked to a young man, I still have the photo we took with him on my phone, a young man who'd committed a crime. He was an accomplice to a crime as a juvenile, was charged as an adult, and a serious crime. He didn't pull the trigger, but he was in the car, and really an unfortunate decision for him to be associated with these folks. But he was, I think, 17 years old, and he had a very long sentence. But I think he was going to get out, possibly have a chance to get out in his late 30s, because he will, if he makes parole the first time. But he was able to. He had a child, but with the earnings from working in prison industries, he was able to pay full child support, send a little money home to his mom, pay for his own incarceration,
restitution,
pay restitution, and also have enough money to pay for the expensive phone calls that he needs to make. And he had
every day that he
made to his daughter and his mother, and he was able to save some money for when he gets out. And he had a business plan. And if his business, but he was smart about it, because he had this business plan. But because of the prison industries, he had a job when he got out with the same company. So it translates from inside the wall to outside the wall. And the people running the business, it was a spiritual experience for them, because they saw the redemption and the restoration at play. And that's what I think really impacted our governor and you and me as well.
In particular
that day. And we're in the process of getting our federal licensure. Thanks to Senate Bill 120, we finally got the legislation passed needed, and hopefully we can put people to work like that. I think it's just a transformational thing.
Well, it's a win-win for everybody.
It is. I just don't see a downside.
Right. You know, an interesting part about that, there was another fellow, if you remember. That gentleman didn't have a child, didn't have any other outstanding debt outside the wall, and he at that time had told us that he had saved $60,000.
Right.
What a heck of a way to start.
That's right.
You know, but the interesting part about that, John, is where are we as a state? Are we forward thinking enough to be able to be aggressive like that, to understand? Because there are many that think that you and I are soft on crime.
Yeah.
Okay? But very, very unrealistic. Do you think that we here in the Commonwealth can start looking positively and forward like that model they have in Kansas?
I think so. There are some who do want to place that label on anyone who talks about ways to be smarter on crime, to be more efficient with resources, to absolutely still hold offenders accountable for their actions, but also work on their reentry and to be to apply some common sense to a system that is really sort of an outlier in this this world. Let me give you an example. The United States comprises less than 5% of the world's population, yet we incarcerate 25% of its prisoners. For every 3 women in a jail or prison cell somewhere in this world, 1 out of those 3 women is in the United States. And Kentucky is 9th in per capita incarceration, second in female per capita incarceration now. And we also have some pretty tough laws on the books. So for anyone that thinks, and I'm a former prosecutor, I've been there.
Okay.
I've been in the courtroom for 20 years. I didn't prosecute for that long, but almost 6 years. But I was always in the courtroom, and I've been a part of this system for a long time, and I've dedicated about the last decade of my life to this. And in states which are very conservative, right-leaning states, led by groups like Right on Crime, which has some of the most well-known conservative voices in the country, like Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, Ed Meese, William Bennett, Governor Rick Perry from Texas. In fact, Texas has led the way on criminal justice reform in this country. So for anyone to say Texas and those leaders there would be soft on crime, that's just a farce. And so anybody that would attack you or me for that, they're just not being honest about it.
Right. You know, an interesting part about that, let's talk further about the CJ PAC.
Yeah.
One of the things I was excited about with that experience is that so often when these are appointed, they're appointed one way or the other depending on what governor's appointing. However, with this CJ PAC, there were Democrats, there were Republicans, there were secretaries like yourself and myself. There were people that had experienced loss due to this. The value of the CJ PAC, can you talk to us about that?
Well, you mentioned it. I mean, we had faith leaders, we had victims advocates that were in the room on every discussion, and so, yeah, every stakeholder in the criminal justice community, those who understand the mental health problems we have in this country, and oftentimes mental health problems come with a substance use disorder.
Right.
I mean, Derrick, by some accounts, we have 25 to 30 million people in this country with a diagnosed substance use disorder. I think the number is higher than that. That's a conservative estimate.
Right.
Give you an example, Derrick. We have, I want to talk about the CJ PAC, but part of that is addressing this problem. We have 24,003 or 400 or 500, given where we are this moment, people in state prison. Almost 18,000 of those have a diagnosed substance use disorder and addiction.
Okay.
We have 44,000 people more on some type of supervision, parole, probation. 38,000 of them have a diagnosed substance use disorder. That doesn't account for all the mental health disorders that are out there as well. So we have largely our population is driven by this addicted, low-level, nonviolent population. And some like me, and I think you, believe that we can do better. There are alternatives to incarceration which are far more effective and cost a fraction of what it costs to incarcerate somebody. Not just the cost of that year in prison, but all those costs we talked about, the breakdown of the family and what that causes over a lifetime, the real cost. So the CJ PAC was brought together to examine all those things, that dynamic, and really try to separate fact from fiction. Because oftentimes people who don't look at who's in prison, they just assume we incarcerate people who are dangerous and violent. But the fact of the matter is, it's time we distinguish who we're mad at and who we're afraid of. And I know that's been said ad nauseum, but the reason it's become so popular is because it's true. And some will push back, but that's just the way it is.
You know, it's interesting also, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I happened to be watching 60 Minutes. And what they shared was at one time we had 500,000 beds for people with mental illnesses. Today we have less than 50,000. And what they also went on to say is that they spoke to the jailer in Chicago. And he was stated that during the winter how his population would balloon because these people are trying to get off the street.
That's right.
And so as you look at, and coming from putting on your old DA's cap, as you look at where we are in the Commonwealth, how are we in relation to incarceration? What does that look like? Give our viewers a picture of where we were, where we are, and where you'd like to see us go to. Because I remember, and the reason I raised that question, I remember you telling me that we're 25,000 today. If we aren't careful in the next couple of years, you said that number could balloon up to 30,000.
I firmly believe that.
Okay, how do we get there? And how do we remedy it?
Well, first question, it's a great question. Back to what does mental health look like? I just so happened I worked for nearly as long in criminal justice, and I think it's really one and the same, but in behavioral health, I worked in that field as well. The time I was practicing law, I worked with a community mental health center for years, and what we've seen in this country is when the Community Mental Health Act was signed into law by President Kennedy, the promise was that we would deinstitutionalize so many thousands of people who were serving time in mental hospitals, as they were known, under really sometimes abhorrent conditions, really inhumane conditions. That was well documented. But the promise is that we would drive these solutions to the community, allow people with behavioral health and mental health, mental illness, to live and work. We would help them through community mental health. Well, community mental health hasn't been properly funded since then.
Right.
So we find ourselves now without those 500,000 beds, as you say, down to 50. But we find ourselves with the only solution that some see is to house them in jail and prison.
Right.
So we've become, we as in corrections and jails, become the largest holder of the mentally ill.
Right.
And does anybody think that's a good solution? Of course not.
Absolutely.
And so and oftentimes we do the same with an addicted population, which again, oftentimes that's one and the same. There's so many. In fact, those who serve time who have an addiction, it's estimated 3/4 of them also have a mental health condition, a diagnosed mental illness.
Right.
In jails especially, it's become a problem. This constant churn of the mentally ill. We're no different than that story in 60 I saw the same story about Chicago. And our jailers would tell you, and law enforcement would tell you, the biggest problem we have in our criminal justice system and in terms of who spends time in jail is the mentally ill.
Right.
It's the biggest problem we have.
Right. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. That's the opioid issue that we're facing in our Commonwealth.
Yeah.
Where are we? What are some of the solutions in your industry? What are you guys thinking? What is the mindset of how we get a lasso around this monster?
Well, two things come to mind. First of all, before I get into it, the good news is a couple things on the good news front. We have a governor who absolutely gets it. The first, it's well documented now that the governor and I had not even met before he called me to talk about my interest in this job. But the first time we met, he came into the room, and under his arm, in his hand, was a book called Dreamland.
Right.
Now that may not mean much. It means something to you. I think you've read it by now. But if you haven't read it, it's really a perspective and a chronology of how we got here as a country.
Right.
This epidemic is different than crack cocaine or meth or anything else, because these, heroin addicts didn't all of a sudden just one day walk down and say, you know what, I want to shove a needle in my arm. I think I want to become a heroin addict. They started, well over 80% of people addicted to any kind of opioid, which is a pain pill, it's heroin, it's fentanyl, carfentanil, or any kind of synthetic analog of those kinds of drugs. It's the morphine molecule. So those people who are addicted to this incredibly addictive and hard to get off of kind of addiction, they started with a legal prescription. Pharmaceutical companies have sold us a lie that in fact these pills are non-addictive, and so they were prescribed by the millions. Give me one example. Clay County, Kentucky. We all love Clay County. I remember covering, when I was long ago, covering those great basketball teams. And I know it's painful. It's President Robert Stivers, our Senate President's home. What a wonderful place. But last year alone, 2.23 million doses of hydrocodone were dispensed in about a 19 to 20,000 person county. That's 150 pills for
person.
Every man, woman, and child in that community. Now, that's 25% less than before we put legislation in place years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, to bring that down. But this country is under siege.
Yes.
We lost 64,000 people, it's now estimated, in 2016 to drug overdoses. Derrick, that's more than the Vietnam War in a decade.
Wow.
So where's the outrage and where's the response? It's now coming. The president has declared a national emergency. And the other good news, beyond having a governor who gets it so he can allow us to do our work and be supportive of all the things that work, the other thing is that Kentucky does have, we're recognized as having some of the best, if not the most innovative and progressive drug policy in the country. But we have to because the problem is so acute. We're one of the most 5 affected states, and however you slice it,
Right.
we are suffering, but all states are.
Right.
But especially because of what happened in the East and what's kind of come to our population triangle now in Lexington, Louisville, Northern Kentucky. It hasn't hit the West as bad yet for whatever reason, but we are under siege, and it's beyond an epidemic, Derrick.
Right.
It's what we call a pandemic
Right.
now.
John, I hate to end our conversation, but there's so much to talk about here, but we got a little window.
All right.
And but I'll have you back on, and we can talk about this further.
You know where to
There's
find me. I'll
so
be
much
back.
more. Yeah, I'm gonna always keep you on the speed dial.
That's right.
Just want to thank you for joining us today to find out what's going on in our Commonwealth, and it has been my honor to have my friend John Tilley. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank
John.
you for having me. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely.